Will President Trump go to war with Iran? That's the question the president is mulling as his negotiators meet in Geneva with Iranian officials over the country's nuclear program and its ballistic missiles. And the U.S. builds a enormous military armada force in the Middle East. What are the stakes for both Iran and for the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, if the president does or does not decide to strike Iran?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
That's our subject for today on Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot here on the daily podcast of Wall Street Journal Opinion. And I'm here with Elliot Kaufman, who is following events closely in Iran and the Middle East. Welcome, Elliot. President Trump's negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are today meeting in Geneva with Iranian officials. They call it indirect talks because apparently the Iranians don't want to have direct talks. But basically, they're using an interlocutor to talk to the Iranians. Let's listen first to Secretary of State Marco Rubio talk about where things stand.
But I want you to understand, and everyone should know, that Iran poses a very grave threat to the United States and has for a very long time. They are in possession, first and foremost, after their nuclear program was obliterated, they were told not to try to restart it. And here they are. You can see them always trying to rebuild elements of it. They're not enriching right now, but they're trying to get to the point where they ultimately can. The other thing I would point you to, however, is that Iran possesses a very large number of ballistic missiles, particularly short-range ballistic missiles that threaten the United States and our bases in the region and our partners in the region. And all of our bases in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. And they also possess naval assets that threaten shipping and try to threaten the U.S. Navy. So I want everybody to understand that, and beyond just the nuclear program, they possess these conventional weapons that are solely designed to attack America and attack Americans if they so choose to do so. These things have to be addressed. The negotiations tomorrow and the talks tomorrow will be largely focused on the nuclear program. And we hope progress can be made, because that's the president's preference, to make progress on the diplomatic front. But it's also important to remember that Iran refuses to talk about the ballistic missiles, to us or to anyone. And that's a big problem.
Those remarks by the Secretary of State made on Wednesday, the day ahead of the negotiations, as these are going on Thursday in Geneva. Elliot, so what does the President of the United States want out of these talks? He obviously wants limits on the nuclear program, but are missiles part of the talks?
Well, he says over and over again that he wants a deal. And I think he does. He does want a deal. But the terms that he talks about tend not to be at all what Iran means when it also says that it wants a deal. Missiles, Iran's stance has been, let's talk about that only afterward. And indeed, they refuse to speak about it at all at these talks.
After there's some nuclear deal.
After there is some nuclear deal, and crucially for them, some sanctions relief.
Yes.
Meaning, when the U.S. has given up leverage, then there can be talks. It also tried to say these sorts of things to President Biden and to President Obama as well. And what happens is you don't end up getting that follow-up on the missiles, on its regional proxy forces as well. So the U.S. has played along with this. Okay, we will talk about nuclear, but it's unclear if the U.S. would be willing to give major sanctions relief without anything guaranteed on the missile program.
And let's address the nuclear program right now. So the president in June joined the Israelis in striking the major nuclear facilities, the three major ones that Iran has had. Much of what was ever there is now buried under rubble. Their ability to enrich uranium up to the enriching is important because it can be used as fuel for a nuclear weapon. That enrichment, whatever they enriched before, was probably underground They maybe secreted some out ahead of time, but they want to continue to enrich now, which is the demand. The U.S. has said, no, we will not allow you to do that. But Iran wants to do that. And then we get mixed signals from the administration. Will they be allowed to enrich? Will it be up to a certain level? Who will control it? Will it be the Russians? Will it be the Iranians? Will they be allowed at all? Can you make sense of what the U.S. demand actually is?
Well, it may have changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, the position backed, by the way, by Republicans in Congress in huge numbers, was no enrichment at all.
Right.
And Secretary Rubio said just recently there is no need for Iran to enrich your uranium.
Sure.
Number one, it doesn't need nuclear power at all with all the oil and gas it has. Number two, even if it wants nuclear energy, there are 23 nations in the world that have peaceful nuclear energy programs and import enriched uranium from abroad. There's no reason Iran couldn't do that. The U.S. has always offered that sort of thing, but they say no every time precisely because they do want to have that option to push for a nuclear weapon. So what is the Trump administration asking for here? No enrichment, but maybe there could be some openings to some exceptions, one reactor above ground, not underground, some limited enrichment, even though even limited enrichment is actually gets you most of the way to what you would need for a nuclear weapon. It's dangerous, but it's interesting. Even that concession, reaching out for a deal, may not be enough for this Iranian regime.
And that is because the regime really does want to maintain an enrichment capability. Both, I assume, because your point, they want to maintain the ability to get to a bomb very quickly, and that requires enrichment on hand. And then also, I think the Khamenei regime, that is led by 87-year-old Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, it's very hard for them, if not impossible for them, to admit that their nuclear ambitions, their nuclear program, which they've invested so many tens of billions of dollars in over the years, simply was an enormous failure.
Yes, and not only have they invested their own people's money in this, but they have incurred international isolation, sanctions, real economic immiseration. And can they now say it was for nothing? We're going to hand it over and say, forget about all that. Well, that is a dangerous proposition for them. And I think it's worth underscoring that right now, Iran cannot enrich uranium.
Whatever capacity it had is underground.
It's buried. The capacity, the facilities have been destroyed.
Right.
Now, they may have a stockpile of some enriched uranium buried underground, which intelligence agencies think they cannot access right now. And so that's something that we are talking about.
But we want them to turn that over and allow inspectors find it, bring it out.
Exactly. And turn it over to the U.S. Not we will turn some of it over to Russia and maybe we'll keep some ourselves. None of that. But I think what Iran has been able to do in these talks is really confuse who is making a concession to whom. Because right now, Iran has no enrichment. It would like to enrich uranium. Allowing it limited enrichment, so-called limited enrichment capability, would be an American concession. Iran's regime, however, tries to pretend that it would be giving up on its full enrichment aspirations by acceding to limited enrichment. And therefore, in exchange for being allowed to do something that right now it cannot do, it is asking for massive sanctions relief. So it is asking for more nuclear capability than it currently has, and we should pay it for the privilege.
All right. So that's where things stand. It sounds to me as if you are highly skeptical that there will be a deal.
That's right.
Now, let's talk about the missiles, because there have been obviously in June and before that, in a previous strike, the Israelis degraded the Iranian missile force considerably, although it still retains thousands of missiles, ballistic missiles, most short and medium term missiles. The short range, rather, and medium range missiles. But it is building up that stockpile again. You had a report this week in the Financial Times saying that they have struck a deal with Russia to import sizable amount of anti-aircraft missiles, advanced anti-aircraft missiles from Russia. And then you had Reuters report that it's looking at a deal with China for anti-ship missiles, of course, which would be able to target American naval ships in the Gulf and the elsewhere in the region. So it really does want to rebuild its missile force, and that is a significant threat here. So if they're not going to make any concessions on that, can the President of the United States say, all right, we'll accept a deal on nuclear now, and then do what Obama did and say, oh, sure, we'll just handle missiles down the line? I mean, we would heavily criticize that deal, because the missiles, if they can rebuild, pose a significant threat at any time to American forces.
Yeah, and Iran has already shown itself willing to fire them, I guess, on 3 separate occasions at Israel, fire them at the U.S. base in Qatar, also fired at Pakistan, militia groups there. It's willing to use these. People, used to say they would never use them. Now it is willing, and it seems that it's actually Iran's most effective tool. The nuclear program was a threat, but the missiles, it can actually shoot. And I think it's worth remembering that back in December, President Trump was asked, if Iran continues reconstituting its missile program, would you support further strikes on Iran? And he said yes. Mm-hmm. He was asked, if Iran starts to rebuild its nuclear program, would you, the U.S., strike? And he said, we would do so immediately. So you have those two, and then throw in what happened very soon afterward, which is Iran massacring its own people. President Trump said 32,000 of them, flagrantly violating, contravening President Trump's red line, which he laid out. So you have 3 justifications right there.
Well, and the president said regarding the slaughter of the Iranian people by the regime, that help is on the way for Iranians. That was weeks ago. And since then, we've had the buildup of the Armada, but help has, it may be on the way, but it hasn't been delivered yet. And I wonder the calculation by the president here. So you've got the nuclear program, you have the missile program, but the slaughtering of people, human rights violations, and more than, this is a massacre of enormous proportions. 32,000, and that data is pretty good. I mean, we've seen the photographs that have been snuck out of row after row after row of corpses who were people mowed down as they demonstrated. That implicates the survivability of the regime. And is Trump willing to use the strikes to put the regime at risk? Now, we know in June, the Israelis, they stopped the 12-day war. They wanted to continue bombing for a while and to hit regime targets that are part of the regime's enforcement mechanism against its own people. And the president said no. U.S. president said, no, let's stop now. We don't want to do that. Then you had the protests erupt, and at the end of the year, and the massacre to put it down by Iran. Now this is the third or fourth massacre of the last decade and a half. So, is the president willing? It's a key question. Willing to strike regime targets, command and control. Maybe even the leader, Ali Khamenei, and his son, who could be succeeding him. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is part of the enforcement mechanism of the regime. And then these Basij militia who ride motorbikes and are particularly ruthless in putting down protests. Are they willing to do that? I mean, that's a key question for the president if he does go with a strike, because if you just do the military forces, the regime might survive. But if you, I mean, the nuclear program and the missiles, the regime might survive. But if you also go after these enforcement groups and the regime itself, then you could really have a larger change.
And if he wants to deliver on his promises to the Iranian people, I think he has to, because as you say, he can hit the regime's missiles and it can rebuild missiles. He can hit a few remaining nuclear sites and it can do whatever it can to rebuild
Wait
those.
out Trump and do with our next president.
Exactly. And it will do that. It will wait out Trump. And I think when this becomes a conversation about nuclear purely, Iran's regime is comfortable. It's been here for 2 decades talking about nuclear issues. And once it gets into the weeds of enrichment and stockpiles, it can handle that. It means it's safe and it can always trade something and survive. But what we saw in January of this year was the regime is not safe. It's as weak as it ever has been. And it is now really at war with its own people, millions of whom turned up in the streets. And Iran's regime has no answer to their grievances. It has no economic way out. It has no ability to offer them a better life. All it could do was meet them with bullets in the streets. And so if the US can hit those crucial IRGC internal repression units, disrupt Iranian command and control, it can give Iran's people an opportunity to create some real change so that the US doesn't keep having to come back and confront this regime over and over again.
All right, let's try to get into the heads of the officials who are debating this inside the administration and talk about the debate inside the administration. We know there were some leaks earlier this week that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, has real misgivings about any strike because of the significant risks to U.S. forces, the deployments having to stay in the Middle East as opposed to being over an aircraft carrier group moving into the Middle East, not being available in Asia, but all the risks of a larger escalation and how that would evolve. On the other hand, there are others who say, there are real risks of not striking. Let's go through those risks, kind of both of those cases. Start with the risks of fairly obvious risks of attacking Iran. One is simply they'll have on the first day. It'd be very hard for the U.S. to take out all of the missiles that Iran has. It can take out certainly be able to disable their a lot of their anti-aircraft defenses and their radars, but they'll be able to get off quite a number, maybe in the thousands of missiles, and hit target American bases. Perhaps we have defenses against that, but something might get through. They might try to disable sink an American ship. They could go after U.S. installations around the Middle East, Iraq, Jordan, Qatar, and elsewhere, or terrorist attacks against the United States. So those risks are very real. And I guess there is also the risk of the unknown, right? What happens inside Iran if the regime does fall? But let's talk about the risks of if Trump, having put together this great armada, as he has, 2 aircraft carrier groups, 100. We've now seen F-22s deployed in Israel, and not from the U.S., but in Israel. Those are very valuable aircraft. So if he has assembled all this and then backs down, what are the risks of that not striking?
I would start with it shores up Iran's regime, essentially lets them out of this moment of greatest danger. And this is America's leading adversary in the region right there. In the same vein, it crushes Iran's protest movement, which was promised and has been waiting and has even resumed protests this
Especially
past
at
week.
Universities, yeah.
Exactly. After that 40-day mourning period concluded. So that's a missed opportunity in Iran. Further on, it gets harder. Iran's regime reconstitutes its military ability, its position at home. Economically, it could recover. You could see the currency, which is, is being pummeled by these threats right now, recover. So if we were ever to do this in the future, it would likely be much more difficult, and all of those risks, which you just mentioned, of action would be increased. But you could also look beyond Iran itself and say Iran's regime will be able to continue acting as part of this axis of anti-American aggressors, supplying missiles and drones to Russia, supplying discounted oil to China.
Right.
And so we would feel this on every other front as well. And then I think third, you just have to talk about American credibility and President Trump's credibility specifically. Not only did he, talk about nuclear and missiles, but he gave Iran a clear red line. He said, if you start shooting at your own people, we will shoot too. If he backs down from all of that and all of this military force turns out to be just for show, I think Russia learns from that. I think China learns from that. And I think it influences their behavior, at least for the rest of President Trump's term in office.
Well, one thing we know about this president is he wants any military engagements to be short and overwhelming use of power, and emerge with what he can claim to be a victory. We had the 24-hour or even less than that operation in Venezuela. We had the June operation in the bombing in Iran, both highly successful military operations, but also very short-lived. This would be more extensive. I mean, my information is that Admiral Bradford Cooper, who is the head of CENTCOM and is responsible for the military plan, has put together a minimum 2-week targeted a list of targets and bombing campaign that would be very extensive across the military assets, the regime's enforcement assets, and command and control as well, and perhaps against regime leaders themselves. And so you're talking about something that would be a higher risk for the president. And the question I would ask is, if I were in the room, was, well, Mr. President, if this gets a little rough, if there are American casualties, if we have airplanes shot down, if they do hit an American air base and kill 40, 50, 60 or more Americans, are you willing to see this through and then move on to really try to topple the regime? Never mind the uncertainties of what might happen next. And I don't know how he would answer that.
It is the question for him. And I think he has learned from his past experience with Iran. And what he has learned is that there are risks, but they may be manageable. And many in the past have probably been guilty of overselling those risks. I think
certainly that was true in June.
Certainly in June. And I think he would look back to his operation against Qasem Soleimani, running the IRGC Quds force.
That was in the assassination in the first term.
In his first term. And Iran responded, not quite as big as had been warned for a major move like that, but it fired off missiles and it injured American troops right there. So U.S. has air defenses and they are formidable, but missiles sometimes and perhaps inevitably make it through. In June, when Israel attacked, Iran was able, after a period of about 12 hours, that's a fairly long wait, it was able to coordinate a salvo of 200 ballistic missiles at once. That is considerable, but it's a far cry from the thousands and thousands that people had warned of. And that was the largest salvo Iran ever got off after that. It sort of dwindled. It could do 100 and then 50 and then 20, ended up firing more than 500 in total, along with more than 1,000 drones. And it wasn't able to down a single Israeli aircraft. It had some hits within Israel, but didn't do major damage to Israeli military or anything like had been forecasted. And so I think President Trump looks at that and says, there is a sense in which Iran is a paper tiger. And yet missiles can still make it through and can still inflict U.S. casualties. Yeah. And you can never rule that out.
I mean, I think that you have to recall that as the U.S. Navy ships were trying to dodge Houthi missiles out of Yemen in that campaign during the Biden years, there were some close-run events there, and an anti-ship missile could always get through. And so you have to ask, okay, how would you respond to that kind of risk? Which is why, Elliot, I'm of the view that the president ought to be preparing the ground with the American people more than he has on this. He did take some time, a few sentences in the State of the Union address to talk about the nature of the regime's depredations against the United States and against its own people and the threat it represents. But he hasn't said, okay, given that, here's why I think it is important for us to disarm this regime in a much more systematic way and reduce the threat much more considerably and stand up for the right of the Iranian people to govern themselves. Our job is not to pick who runs Iran, but it is to make sure that the people can have a say in who they elect, and so that regime is not a threat to the region and to the United States. He hasn't made that case, and there's a good case, as you laid out, for that case. It's a regime since 1979 that has the blood of probably literally thousands of Americans on its hands, particularly through the roadside bombs in Iraq during the Iraq War. But there are many other incidents, and they tried to kill this president. We know there is a plot to kill this president. I don't think Trump's actions here are at all personal in that sense, but I do think. They put out death threats on Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, on John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, on Brian Hook, who was had the Iran portfolio of the State Department. These are very bad people, and they threaten the United States, and that's one reason to take this action.
And it was notable that he felt the need at his State of the Union address to explain to the American people why this Iranian regime is bad, is monstrous, is a threat to the U.S. I think you're right, though, that he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't say, and that's why action is necessary, and not just in the abstract, but now. Mm-hmm. That's why this is the time. And he certainly didn't lay out what the risks of that action might be. And I think Americans will need to hear that so that you don't find yourself a week into a war, maybe something didn't go the way you planned. That often happens. And then Americans start asking, why are we in this in the first place?
Right, exactly. And he needs allies on Capitol Hill, for example. You know, I mean, he has a couple, but not many who are willing to speak up. And you can understand that they're not going to speak up if he's not speaking up. And you know, if you have look, the Democrats are going to attack Trump in this political environment, no matter what. They're not going to be with him. Some might if he actually made an effort, but that's probably too late right now. But he does need Republicans on his side, and he does need a lot of them to understand, okay, what are we doing? Here's the plan. Here's what we're attempting to do. Here's why, and I'd like your support. Yeah. All right. So we will leave it there today. Elliot Kaufman, thanks so much for joining us. We are here every day on Potomac Watch. We follow the world here, and we will follow events in the Middle East, certainly regarding Iran and any developments diplomatically as well as militarily. Thanks for listening. Appreciate having you with us.